Rachel Moore had always been someone who built her world out of shapes, light, and space rather than just possessions, and when she finally bought a modest house in a quiet cul-de-sac, she felt as if she had been given a second chance at life. She was an architect by trade, though she no longer worked in a firm, burned out after years of deadlines and clients who cared more about resale value than vision. After her divorce, she retreated into solitude, pouring herself into small design projects that were entirely her own, with no one else to please and no committee to argue with. The most ambitious of these projects began almost by accident. A greenhouse in her backyard, something she initially envisioned as a place to nurture herbs, small citrus trees, and a collection of rare orchids she had once promised herself she would cultivate when her life was calmer. But as the weeks passed, the structure grew beyond the scale she had imagined. It wasn't a simple glass shed. It was a carefully articulated building, a fusion of steel ribs and transparent panels, angles that caught the afternoon sun, and a ventilation system she engineered herself. The greenhouse became less about plants and more about the act of reclaiming control over her creativity. Each pane of glass she installed felt like a piece of her old identity returning, proof that she could still create something meaningful and enduring. She spent long evenings in the structure, seated on a simple stool among the growing greenery, listening to the sound of her own breathing as condensation beaded and slid down the panes around her. The air inside carried a different weight, warm and fragrant, reminding her of the first design studio she had entered as a student when every drawing felt like a revelation. Neighbors occasionally peered over the fence, curious about the strange modernist construction rising behind her house, but Rachel barely noticed them. For the first time in years, she felt anchored, grounded in something that was hers alone. It was not simply about gardening or design. It was a statement of survival after loss, a visible manifestation of resilience that stood in sharp contrast to the pale beige conformity of the surrounding houses. Rachel was not naive, though, and she understood that any structure in a neighborhood governed by a homeowners association was bound to draw attention. She had skimmed the bylaws when she bought the property, but the language was so dense, filled with overlapping clauses and cross-references, that she convinced herself she could interpret it flexibly. Besides, the greenhouse was technically on her property, built within the setbacks, and in her mind there was nothing in its form that violated the spirit of the rules. She considered filing for formal approval but hesitated, not out of defiance but out of instinct, a sense that the HOA board did not exist to encourage initiative but to suppress it. She had watched them bicker about mailbox colors and fence heights at meetings, their voices filled with the self-importance of minor officials who knew their authority extended only to shrubs and driveways. She doubted they would understand a greenhouse as anything but a violation, and so she quietly built without asking, trusting her calculations and the precision of her work. In the weeks that followed its completion, the greenhouse became more than a retreat. It turned into a living companion. When she woke restless at night, she padded barefoot across the lawn to sit inside among the plants, where the silence was never empty but always humming with subtle life. On mornings when she doubted herself, she ran her fingers along the frame she had welded, reminding herself that she had brought steel and glass into harmony with her bare hands. It was no longer just a building. It was the first place that felt entirely like home. Yet even as she immersed herself in its quiet rhythm, a faint unease lingered at the edges of her awareness. Something about the way certain cars slowed when they passed her street, the way conversations stopped when she entered the small neighborhood cafe, suggested that the greenhouse was not simply a curiosity, but a provocation. She told herself it was only imagination, but the thought persisted, and somewhere deep inside she sensed that what she had created would not remain hers alone for long. The first sign that her sanctuary would not be left alone arrived without ceremony on an ordinary Thursday afternoon. Rachel returned from a long walk to find a thick envelope wedged between the pages of her mailbox, bearing the emblem of the Homeowners Association in sharp embossed lettering. She carried it inside, setting it on the kitchen counter while she poured herself a glass of water, telling herself it was probably nothing more than a reminder about dues or a newsletter about seasonal landscaping. Still, a quiet dread lingered as she slit the envelope open and pulled out the papers inside. The letter was written in the flat, bureaucratic language she had come to despise, a tone of cold neutrality that masked aggression. Notice of non-compliance. The document stated that her greenhouse constituted an unauthorized structure, that it violated both aesthetic uniformity standards and unapproved modification clauses, and that unless she submitted proof of compliance or dismantled the structure, within 30 days, escalating fines would be imposed, followed by legal action. She read it twice, her eyes moving more slowly the second time, as if careful study might reveal some clause that transformed the absurdity into a misunderstanding. But it was clear enough. They were not asking for explanation. They were demanding obedience. At first she laughed, though the sound was brittle and hollow in her kitchen. She could almost picture the board members, seated around their long laminate table, reading her name from the complaint with smug satisfaction. It wasn't about the greenhouse at all. It was about the audacity of building something without kneeling for their approval. She tossed the letter aside, determined not to let it rattle her. Yet as the evening stretched on, her confidence ebbed. She carried her dinner out to the greenhouse, eating under the warm glass dome as twilight settled. But even there, the words of the notice clung to her thoughts. Aesthetic uniformity. The phrase replayed itself with mechanical cruelty, as though the plants she had tended with such care were nothing but violations to be eradicated. For the first time since she had begun building, the greenhouse felt fragile, a thing that could be taken from her not by storm or accident, but by decree. The next morning, another shock awaited her. Resting against her front door was a shard of glass, unmistakably from her greenhouse. She recognized the thickness, the faint green tint of its edge. It had been placed carefully, almost ceremoniously, not smashed in anger, but arranged like a warning. Beside it lay a small scrap of paper torn from a legal pad, scrawled with 5 words in heavy black ink, "This won't last for long." Rachel stared at it for several minutes, her breath shallow before finally picking it up with trembling hands. Whoever had left it had crossed the line from regulation into intimidation, and though she wanted to dismiss it as a prank, she could not. The handwriting was bold and deliberate, the act premeditated. She thought of her neighbors, of the ones who smiled politely but never met her eyes, of the cars that slowed as they passed. Suddenly, the neighborhood felt like a stage where everyone else knew the script except her. By mid-afternoon, she drove to the association's office, a sterile suite tucked into a strip mall between a dry cleaner and a tax service, determined to confront them directly. The receptionist, a woman with lacquered nails and the expression of someone paid to ignore frustration, asked if she had an appointment. When Rachel said no but insisted it was urgent, the woman disappeared into a back hallway and returned moments later with the association president, Jonathan Pike. He was a tall man in his 50s with the sharp haircut of someone who had never stopped believing he was destined for greater authority. He ushered Rachel into a small meeting room where the air smelled faintly of toner and old carpet. She placed the notice on the table and demanded an explanation. Pike did not bother reading it, only folded his hands and gave her a thin smile. "The board has reviewed the matter," he said smoothly, "and determined your structure does not conform to community standards. The rules are in place for everyone's benefit. Exceptions weaken the cohesion of the neighborhood." Rachel pressed him, asking for the specific bylaw she had violated, for the record of votes taken, for any documentation showing that her greenhouse posed a problem beyond appearance. His responses were evasive, a circular logic that always returned to standards and compliance. When she mentioned the threatening note left at her door, his eyes flickered with brief recognition before he leaned back, feigning indifference. "If you believe someone is harassing you, that is a separate matter," he said, almost mocking. The association cannot control what private citizens do on their own time. The implication chilled her. Whoever had left the shard of glass might very well be someone in that room, and Pike was content to let the intimidation do its work. She realized then that the HOA's power was not merely in its rules, but in its ability to create an atmosphere where opposition became unbearable. Driving home, Rachel's mind churned with unease. She thought of calling the police about the note, but what would she say? That someone had left her a piece of her own greenhouse on her porch? That the HOA president smirked when she described it? The evidence was too thin, the act too subtle to provoke investigation. The silence of her street when she parked felt heavier than usual, as though every window concealed a watchful eye. That night, while she sat inside the greenhouse with the lights off, she noticed a movement on the sidewalk, a figure lingering for a moment before walking on. She could not see the face, only the outline, but the message was clear enough. The letter had not been an opening salvo but a declaration. They wanted her gone, and the greenhouse was only the excuse. The following week confirmed what Rachel had begun to suspect. The fight over her greenhouse was not going to be a matter of simple misunderstandings or polite discussions about design. It was something calculated, and it was becoming more aggressive with every passing day. When she attended the next homeowners association meeting, held in the bland community hall across from the elementary school, she walked in prepared with her folder of documents, plans, property surveys, even photographs showing the greenhouse, positioned well within her lot lines. She hoped that reason, presented calmly, might at least slow their campaign against her. Instead, the atmosphere felt staged the moment she entered. Conversation stopped as she approached, and the board members sat already assembled at the long table, papers stacked before them, as if the verdict had been written before she had even opened her mouth. Jonathan Pike, presiding over the meeting with the smug confidence of a man certain of his own authority, barely allowed her to speak. When she tried to explain the greenhouse's compliance with setback requirements, he interrupted with a declaration that the issue was not legal boundaries, but neighborhood character. His voice carried across the room with the air of someone delivering judgment rather than opinion. "It is our responsibility," he said, "to preserve the visual harmony of this community. Individual projects, however well-intentioned, that deviate from this harmony endanger the collective value of all our homes." A murmur of agreement ran through several attendees, though Rachel noticed that many avoided eye contact. Their assent, delivered more out of fear of being seen as dissenters than from genuine conviction. She raised the matter of the threatening note, placing the scrap of paper on the table in full view, but Pike pushed it aside with the corner of his clipboard, dismissing it as irrelevant. He then produced a document she had not seen before, a so-called compliance survey that, according to him, had been conducted by the board to assess unauthorized structures. It was filled with vague descriptions about sightlines and architectural consistency, written in language that sounded official but collapsed under scrutiny. Rachel requested the names of the surveyors, but Pike told her those records were internal. When she pressed further, his tone hardened. "If you want to pursue this in court, Ms. Moore, that is of course your right, but until then, the association's decision stands." The way he said it, calm but cutting, made it clear that he counted on her exhaustion, her unwillingness to spend months battling a faceless bureaucracy. The sense of orchestration only deepened later that night when Rachel returned home to find small metal stakes driven into the ground near her greenhouse, bright orange ribbons tied to them fluttering in the breeze. They were the kind surveyors used, except no official crew had been scheduled in the area. Someone had come onto her property unannounced, leaving behind the suggestion of impending measurement, as though preparing the land for seizure. She pulled them out one by one, her hands shaking, and carried them inside as proof, though she knew that presenting them would likely lead to more dismissals. Still, the message was clear. She was not simply being pressured to comply, she was being prepared for erasure. The days that followed became a blur of subtle harassment. Flyers appeared on her windshield when she parked downtown, unsigned notices warning that community violations bring down property values. A neighbor she barely knew stopped her on the sidewalk and, with a rehearsed concern, asked if she realized her greenhouse could invite pests into the neighborhood. Another time, Rachel returned home to find her garbage bins overturned and soil scattered across her driveway, though nothing was stolen. Each act was small enough to be deniable, to be brushed off as coincidence, but together they formed a pattern, one that grew impossible to ignore. Inside the greenhouse, her refuge began to feel less like sanctuary and more like contested territory. She noticed a pane of glass that had been deliberately scratched with a fine, sharp object, leaving a line that caught the light whenever she entered. A few of her plants began to wither unexpectedly, and though she could not prove sabotage, she wondered if someone had sprayed something toxic onto the soil when she was away. The unease grew until she began to dread leaving the house, fearing what small damage might greet her return. It was not the scale of the attacks that unnerved her, but the persistence and precision, the way they seemed designed to erode her resolve. Her professional instincts as an architect told her to fight with evidence, to document everything. She began keeping meticulous records, photographs of the stakes, copies of the letters, notes of the times she noticed strangers near her property. But a part of her understood that the battle was not about logic or legality. It was about pressure, about making her believe that she was isolated and powerless against a group that could rewrite rules as they pleased. The HOA was not interested in whether her greenhouse met building codes. They wanted submission, and they would chip away at her until she yielded or collapsed. One evening, as she sat at her kitchen table surrounded by papers, Rachel realized how dramatically the tone of her life had shifted. Only months ago, she had spent her nights sketching ideas for new additions to the greenhouse, dreaming about expanding it into a series of connected pavilions. Now she spent them analyzing bylaws, searching for loopholes, and waiting for the next sign of intrusion. She felt both anger and a creeping despair. She had built the greenhouse as a gesture of freedom, a reclaiming of her own voice after years of compromise. Now it had become a target, a battlefield she had not chosen but could not abandon. The escalation had begun, and she knew instinctively that retreat would not satisfy them. If she dismantled the greenhouse tomorrow, they would only find another pretext to pursue her. The fight was no longer about glass and steel. It was about whether she had the right to exist in her own space without bending to their will. Rachel knew that she could not continue reacting defensively to every new maneuver from the association. Their tactics were designed to keep her disoriented, forever on the back foot. But she realized that if she wanted to preserve her greenhouse and her peace of mind, she had to find a way to strike at the foundation of their case rather than arguing about appearances or so-called neighborhood harmony. Her training as an architect had taught her that every structure, no matter how imposing, had weak points, and the same had to be true of this campaign against her. The problem was not whether the greenhouse looked too modern, or whether it clashed with the muted palette of vinyl siding and asphalt shingles that surrounded her. The problem was the claim that she had violated some binding rule, and if that claim collapsed, the entire edifice of their argument might collapse with it. Determined to trace the complaint back to its source, she drove one gray morning to the county records office, a place she had visited only once before when closing on her house. The building itself was uninspiring. A low concrete rectangle from the 1970s that smelled faintly of dust and carpet glue, but inside was a labyrinth of files and microfiche, the physical memory of every parcel and boundary in the region. Rachel approached the clerk at the desk and explained that she needed to review property maps and surveys for her address. The woman, with tired eyes but a hint of sympathy in her voice, led her to a workstation and keyed in the information. After a moment, the clerk frowned and printed several sheets. "It looks like there were adjustments filed recently," she said, sliding the papers across. "Your parcel lines were updated 2 years ago." Rachel studied the diagrams with growing disbelief. The new maps showed her lot shifted subtly to the east, its boundary trimmed by a few meters, just enough to place the greenhouse outside of compliance. She shook her head, insisting that this could not be correct, that the house itself had been built decades earlier with established surveys. The clerk, lowering her voice as though reluctant to be overheard, admitted that Rachel was not the first homeowner to come in confused about altered boundaries. Sometimes associations submit updates, she said carefully, and if they're filed with the right signatures, they get recorded. Not everyone notices until a dispute comes up. The words chilled Rachel more than any threatening note. It was one thing to be bullied with flyers and insults, another thing entirely to realize that the legal record of her land had been manipulated. She asked to see the historical files, and after an hour of sifting through rolls of microfilm, she found what she had been searching for: an older survey from 25 years earlier, signed and sealed, showing her property as originally plotted. Every measurement was precise, every line drawn by a licensed surveyor, and on the margin was the signature of her father, who in those years had worked as a consultant on local projects. She felt a pang of memory at the sight of his familiar scrawl, steadier than hers but with the same angular lean. Holding that document, she felt a surge of defiance. The greenhouse stood exactly where it was meant to, and the only fraud was the so-called update that had been slipped into the record. She made certified copies of the old survey and carried them home like precious cargo. That evening, she spread everything across her dining table: the notices from the HOA, the photographs of stakes and scratches, the flyers and anonymous warnings, and now, most importantly, the proof that the very foundation of their claim was rotten. For the first time in weeks, she felt something like control, but she also knew that evidence alone might not be enough. If the association had gone so far as to alter official records, then they were not acting alone, and she needed someone who could navigate the legal terrain with more authority than she could summon on her own. Through a colleague from her days at the architecture firm, she was referred to an attorney named Mia Rodriguez, who specialized in land use disputes. Mia was younger than Rachel expected, sharp-eyed and relentless in her questions, with a reputation for pursuing cases that others avoided. When Rachel laid out the documents in Mia's office, the lawyer listened intently, occasionally tapping her pen against her notebook. "This is bigger than a zoning quarrel," she finally said. "If these boundary changes were filed without your knowledge, and especially if they contradict older surveys, then we're talking about document tampering. That's not just civil. That's potentially criminal." Rachel felt both relieved and unsettled by the gravity of the statement. She had come hoping for reassurance, but what Mia offered was clarity, and clarity meant escalation. Mia advised her to keep documenting every incident, every odd encounter, every scrap of paper slipped under her door. "Patterns matter," she explained. "A single note can be dismissed." A series of coordinated actions shows intent. She also suggested filing a formal request with the court for a declaratory judgment to confirm the true boundaries of Rachel's property. It was not a fast process, but it would bring the issue into a legal arena where fabricated surveys would be scrutinized by experts rather than accepted on authority. "They want you to feel cornered," Mia said, her voice calm but firm. "The best way to fight back is to show that you're not just resisting. You're exposing what they've done." Rachel left the office with a mixture of dread and determination. She knew now that the battle was not about appearances or neighborhood cohesion, but about control through deception. The greenhouse had become the focal point of something larger, a contest not only over her land but over whether the truth could be rewritten by those who held local power. Driving home, she glanced in her rearview mirror and thought she saw the same dark sedan that had slowed past her street a few nights earlier. It turned off before she could be certain, but the unease settled heavy in her chest. She reminded herself that fear was part of their weapon, and that exposing their tactics would require enduring it. That night, she returned to the greenhouse and sat among the plants with the old survey resting on her lap. The air smelled of damp soil and lemon blossoms, a scent that seemed to anchor her to reality. She thought of her father, of the way he used to say that boundaries were only as strong as the honesty of those who drew them. Looking around at the structure she had built with her own hands, Rachel realized she was no longer fighting to preserve a hobby. She was fighting to protect the integrity of her home, her name, and the truth itself. And for the first time, she felt ready not only to defend but to confront. The midpoint had arrived, the moment when resistance hardened into resolve, and retreat was no longer an option. The filing of the declaratory judgment did not quiet the association as Rachel and Mia had hoped. Instead, it acted like a stone thrown into a wasp's nest, stirring their hostility into a sharper, more reckless form. Within days of the court's acceptance of the petition, Rachel began noticing unfamiliar cars idling at the corner of her street, vehicles that never belonged to her neighbors, their drivers staring too intently at their phones or pretending to be, waiting for someone. One morning, she found her mailbox stuffed with photocopied pamphlets that warned about non-compliant structures threatening community values. The same lines that Jonathan Pike had repeated at meetings, though now multiplied into crude propaganda. Her name was not printed on them, but everyone in the neighborhood could guess who the message targeted, and Rachel felt a tightening isolation as some of her neighbors stopped waving or quickly crossed the street to avoid conversation. The harassment took a more material form soon after. She came home one evening to discover that the lock on her side gate had been tampered with, the latch bent as if forced open by someone trying to gain entry. Nothing was stolen, but in her greenhouse she noticed several of her carefully tended plants disturbed, their pots shifted or overturned, soil scattered across the tiles. She crouched to clean the mess, her hands trembling not from the damage but from the violation, the realization that someone had stood in the space she had built as sanctuary and tried to spoil it. She documented everything with photographs for Mia, who urged her to remain vigilant but cautioned her against direct confrontation. "They want you rattled," the lawyer explained. "They want you angry enough to make mistakes. If we keep building the record, the pressure will backfire on them." Rachel clung to that strategy, but it was tested severely when the HOA escalated into legal theatrics of their own. They filed an injunction demanding the immediate dismantling of the greenhouse, claiming that it posed a safety hazard to the community. Attached were affidavits signed by supposed neighbors, each swearing that the glass structure reflected sunlight dangerously into traffic, or that it might collapse in high winds and send shards across property lines. Reading the affidavits, Rachel recognized two names as belonging to people who did not even live on her street, and a third belonged to a house that had been vacant for months. Mia was quick to note the inconsistencies and prepare a rebuttal, but the mere existence of these claims left Rachel reeling. The association was willing not just to bend the truth, but to invent it outright, creating a paper reality that might carry the weight of authority unless challenged. The strain wore on her daily life. She continued her work as a consultant, drafting small residential plans for distant clients, but concentration slipped as her mind circled the conflict endlessly. Friends outside the neighborhood noticed her growing distraction, and one even suggested she should abandon the fight and move. The thought tempted her in moments of exhaustion, yet whenever she considered leaving, she felt the anger rise. To walk away would not only mean surrendering her home, but validating the tactics of those who thrived on intimidation and deceit. It was not simply about a greenhouse anymore. It was about whether truth could be erased by persistence and paperwork. The turning point in this escalation came during a scheduled hearing where both sides were meant to present preliminary evidence. Rachel sat at the long wooden table beside Mia, clutching the folder of documents like a shield, while across from them, Jonathan Pike and two association board members looked unnervingly relaxed, whispering among themselves with faint smirks. They presented their affidavits with a flourish, emphasizing the supposed danger posed by Rachel's illegal construction. When it was Mia's turn, she laid out the older survey, the discrepancies in signatures, and the evidence of tampered, Boundaries. The judge listened without comment, but at one moment, when Mia pointed out that one of the affidavits came from a property whose owner had been deceased for over a year, Rachel noticed a flicker of irritation cross the judge's face, as though he, too, had begun to sense the farce. Although no final ruling was made that day, the hearing marked a subtle shift. The HOA's attempt to overwhelm Rachel with fabricated testimony had drawn scrutiny onto themselves, and for the first time she felt the pressure leaning back toward them. Yet this small victory only deepened the danger, for people who felt their control slipping were often the most desperate. That night, Rachel found a new message slipped under her door, not scrawled hastily like the earlier one, but typed neatly on heavy paper. Some fights aren't worth the cost. Walk away while you can. She held the paper under the lamp for a long time, recognizing the deliberate calm of the threat, so much colder than crude intimidation. The second escalation had stripped away the illusion that she was dealing with petty rule-keepers clinging to neighborhood authority. What she faced now was something organized, coordinated, and willing to falsify reality itself to achieve their end. But Rachel, staring out the greenhouse windows as dawn light filtered through the glass, felt her fear harden into a kind of resolve she had not known she possessed. They had crossed into open deceit, and by doing so, they had revealed the weakness of their foundation. The next stage would be decisive, and she knew she had no choice but to meet it head-on. The courtroom was colder than Rachel expected, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly above the polished wood as if the very air carried the tension of unfinished battles. She sat beside Mia at the long table, her folder of documents resting heavily in front of her, though she knew that by this stage every page had already been scrutinized, copied, and entered into the record. Across the aisle, Jonathan Pike appeared unshaken, leaning back in his chair with the detached confidence of someone convinced that the rules would bend for him the way they always had. He had brought witnesses again, the same supposed neighbors who had sworn to seeing dangers and violations in her greenhouse, but already their composure seemed thinner than before. One man avoided her gaze entirely, staring instead at the floor, while another whispered nervously to Pike, who silenced him with a curt nod. The judge began the session with little ceremony, reminding both parties that the issue at hand was not sentiment or preference, but fact, the legality of the greenhouse and the integrity of the property records. When Pike's attorney spoke, his words flowed with polished authority, painting Rachel's structure as a reckless indulgence, a blight on the carefully maintained character of the neighborhood. He cited bylaws and clauses, describing uniformity as if it were a sacred principle, warning of the precedent that would be set if one resident were permitted to ignore collective rules. For a moment, Rachel felt the old fear tug at her, fear that the sheer weight of rhetoric, of official language, could crush her regardless of truth. But then Mia rose, her voice steady and deliberate, and placed the original survey on the judge's desk. She explained the timeline, how the boundary changes had been filed quietly years after Rachel purchased her home, how the so-called updates contradicted sealed records signed by a licensed surveyor decades earlier. She highlighted the inconsistencies in the affidavits, one from a property long vacant, another from an owner who had passed away. Piece by piece, she dismantled the edifice the association had built, exposing not only the fragility of their evidence but the audacity of their fabrications. When she produced the copy of the threatening note and described the unexplained intrusions into Rachel's greenhouse, the courtroom fell into a hush so deep that even the hum of the lights seemed to fade. The turning point came not from argument but from the testimony of one of Pike's own witnesses. Pressed by the judge to describe the location of his home, the man stumbled, hesitated, then gave an address that did not exist within the subdivision. The silence that followed was heavier than any outburst. The judge's eyes narrowed, and suddenly the balance of power in the room shifted, the association's veneer of authority cracking under the weight of exposure. Pike attempted to interject, to claim misunderstanding, but the judge cut him off with a firmness that silenced even his habitual arrogance. Rachel felt her heartbeat pound in her ears as the judge delivered his decision. The greenhouse was not a violation, but a lawful structure, protected by both the original survey and by the rights of ownership. The altered boundaries were deemed invalid, their filing tainted by inconsistencies that demanded further investigation. The affidavits, exposed as fabrications, were struck from the record. Most damning of all, the judge announced that evidence of possible document tampering would be referred to the county prosecutor for review. Pike's face drained of color, his hands tightening around his pen until it snapped in half, while murmurs rippled through the gallery of neighbors who had come to watch. Rachel sat frozen for a moment, hardly able to absorb what had just happened. Weeks of fear, of feeling surrounded and outnumbered, had led to this moment of sudden clarity. The truth had not only survived, but prevailed. The greenhouse that had once seemed so fragile in the face of hostility was now stronger than ever, legitimized not just as her private sanctuary, but as an example recognized in law. When Mia touched her arm with a rare smile, Rachel exhaled a breath she had been holding since the battle began. The war was not finished. There would still be fallout, still be shadows of intimidation lingering in her neighborhood, but the center of the storm had broken, and for the first time she could see a path forward. The days that followed the ruling unfolded with an almost surreal quiet. Rachel had braced herself for some immediate reprisal, for more notes or broken glass or sudden confrontations in the street. But instead, the neighborhood seemed to retreat into an uneasy stillness. Jonathan Pike resigned from the board within a week, officially citing personal reasons, though no one could miss the way his departure coincided with whispers of a broader investigation into altered records and fabricated affidavits. The same neighbors who once crossed the street to avoid her now offered tentative smiles, some out of relief that the conflict had ended, others perhaps out of shame for their silence while it raged. Rachel accepted their gestures politely, though she no longer needed their validation. She had fought the battle alone, and the victory was hers to carry. The greenhouse itself seemed to breathe easier, as if the plants sensed the change in atmosphere. Rachel spent long evenings inside, tending to the rows of greenery, listening to the gentle tap of rain against the glass. The structure no longer felt like a fragile dream under siege, but like something permanent, a place whose very existence had been tested and confirmed. When a letter arrived from the county announcing that her property survey had been restored to its rightful record and that the greenhouse was to be noted as a legitimate improvement, she read it twice, then pinned it to the wall inside the greenhouse as though it were a certificate of survival. Yet, even in victory, a subtle unease lingered. She still caught sight of unfamiliar cars sometimes, still felt the weight of gazes that slid away too quickly. It reminded her that while one battle had ended, the forces that sought to control through intimidation had not disappeared. They had simply been forced into retreat, but she no longer felt vulnerable to them. She understood now that strength was not only in structures of steel and glass, but in the persistence to defend them. As twilight filled the greenhouse with amber light, Rachel allowed herself a rare smile. What had begun as a personal project had become a symbol, not just to her but to anyone who might one day face the same quiet erasures of truth. Her greenhouse was no longer just a sanctuary. It was a precedent, a living testament that stood against silence and submission.